everybody. Welcome back to Remote Learning. We're going to jump right into it. We're going to continue where we left off when it comes to Jamestown and John Smith. And today we're going to be talking about a very famous lady called Pocahontas. So you might have heard of Pocahontas before, you might have seen the Disney film, but this story is very, very different from what you might have grown up with. So we're going to be debunking some myths today. We're going to be talking about John Smith and Pocahontas and what her story was. Now we're going to be jumping a little bit ahead of time, and then we're going to be going back next week to talk a little bit about the slave trade and indentured labor. You kind of started reading about that already. We're going to be doing a whole video series next week on, like I said, the slave trade, indentured labor, and tobacco. So we're going to be talking about that next week, but today I thought that we would talk a little bit about Pocahontas and John Smith. So grab a snack, grab your note-taking stuff, grab a drink of water, and let's get into it. So, John Smith and his troop get to Jamestown in 1607, and they settle down in this really swampy area. Well, although indigenous people didn't find this area to be desirable, they still saw John Smith and his men as a threat to their way of life. So there is a leader, and his name is Powhatan, and he is the leader of a Algonquin tribe in the area of Jamestown called the Chesapeake Bay. Now, the colonists and the Algonquin people had an interesting relationship. It was one that was hostile, but they wanted it to work. They didn't want to have raging wars all the time. They wanted to come to some sort of an agreement, but that agreement never could quite be met. So John Smith one day went to Powhatan, who was the leader of the Algonquins, and they were having a conversation. And John Smith, remember, is an amazing author, right? He has amazing works out there that you can actually read what are his first-hand accounts of all of his explorations. And in his account, he said he was having a magnificent feast with the leader of the tribe, and that's when things started to turn slightly. He was about to be executed because he had done some sort of formality in an incorrect way, or he had offended the tribe in some way. Remember, this is his first-hand account, so a lot of it's probably a little bit skewed, probably a little bit exaggerated. Now, in his account, he's about to be executed by the Algonquin tribe leader Powhatan, when all of a sudden, a girl about 12 or 13 years old throws herself on top of John Smith and cries out to save his life. Now, in this account, John Smith is truly scared for his life. He believes that he is going to be executed and he's going to die. In other accounts, however, it's said that there was an Algonquin ritual that was kind of like a mock execution. It was to show the power and the grace that the tribe leader had over all people in the land. Now, this story doesn't read quite as well as the idea of a young girl saving an older explorer's life, but it still could be true, right? That's why we have to look at things through a historical lens. But in John Smith's account, this young girl by the name of Matawaka, But in John Smith's account, a young girl throws herself on top of him and cries out to her father, Powhatan, to save this man's life. Now, this young girl, her real name isn't actually Pocahontas. It's kind of a nickname that means playful one. Her real name is Matawaka. After this account, it is said that the Algonquin people and the colonists start to have a better relationship with one another, and Pocahontas is kind of that center of that relationship. John Smith writes about her and says how she would visit the colonies and she would play with the other children, and she got to know all of the other colonists, and this became a center point of the relationship between the Algonquin people and the colonists. Now, in 1609, things change a little bit. The Algonquin people and the colonists are in a bit of a disagreement and a bit of a fight, And that's when John Smith gets injured. John Smith goes out on a boat, and there's lots of gunpowder in the boat, and there's some sort of thing that lights this gunpowder off, and the boat explodes. And he is so badly injured that he has to go back to England, and that's in 1609. And this is where things go a little bit sticky for the Algonquin people and the colonists. Without John Smith there as a go-between between the two tribes, Pocahontas stops visiting, and there isn't that relationship piece there anymore that you need with the Algonquin people because they know the land so well, right? That's how the colonists were surviving. Now that relationship piece is gone. And although it's romanticized in Disney, right, where John Smith and Pocahontas have this incredible loving relationship, and it's a romantic relationship, that probably wasn't the case. It was more so of a niece uncle type of situation. But without that relationship piece there of John Smith and Pocahontas, the colony kind of starts to fall apart without that Algonquin piece there. So this is when things take a really terrible turn for Pocahontas. She ends up being kidnapped from her tribe and taken to the colony as a hostage. And this hostage ends up being that piece between the Algonquin people and the colony, right? The colony can use Pocahontas as leverage to get what they want from the Algonquins. So life for Pocahontas starts going downhill pretty quickly. She is made to now be an English woman. So she's baptized, which means that now she's not considered Algonquin anymore, but now she's considered English, she's considered Christian. Her name is changed to Rebecca, and she ends up getting married to a very important man by the name of John Rolfe, who we'll be talking about a lot of later, and his contributions to how Jamestown actually kind of made it through the really terrible times that they had. So she's married off to John Rolfe in 1614. She's probably about 17, 18 years old. He's about 29 years old, and her name is now Rebecca Rolfe. They have a son whose name is Thomas, and he is born in 1615, and she's brought to England in 1616. Now, John Rolfe and John Smith had written to Queen Anne all about Pocahontas, about how she was the perfect example of evangelism and being a missionary in these new lands. So not only were they searching for gold, which, spoiler alert, they never found, not only were they colonizing, but they were also being missionaries, and they were turning these savage, which is a terrible term, these savage people into Christian English people. So this was the perfect example of why they needed more money, more funds, more boats, more people to colonize these areas in order to help all of these other people that were there, the indigenous people, when in fact the indigenous people were helping the colonists. So Pocahontas gets to England and she is paraded around. She's paraded around as the Princess of Chesapeake, or the Princess of the Algonquins, when in fact that's not how that lineage worked at all, but it made her sound a whole lot more important. She was brought to balls, and she was shown to royalty, and she was brought to big events, and she was dressed up, and they would powder her face to make her look more fair, and she was the perfect example of a converted indigenous person. Now, going back to John Smith, when he left for England, the colonists told Pocahontas that he had died, whether that's because they didn't like John Smith and they didn't want that connection between Pocahontas and John Smith, or whether it was political leverage or hostage leverage, we don't know. But they had told Pocahontas that John Smith had died, but at an event in England, they met again. And John Smith writes that she seemed sad and she seemed discontent, and that she was upset with him because he had abandoned her and her tribe. John Smith said that he didn't argue her claims simply because he saw her as somebody of great importance and of higher leverage than him. Now, England was not where John Rolfe and Pocahontas were supposed to stay. In fact, in March of 1617, after they had only been in England for a short time, they decided that they were going to sail back to Virginia. Unfortunately, on the way there, they didn't even get very far. Just off the coast of England, Pocahontas fell gravely ill. Now, people don't know why she was ill. It could have been smallpox or tuberculosis. Some even go as far as saying that she was poisoned, but she fell ill and she died. And according to John Rolfe's writings, she died saying, "All must die, but 'tis enough that her child liveth." So she was saying that her life would continue through her son, Thomas. Now that is all for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next week, we'll be talking just a little bit more about Jamestown, and we're gonna start talking about something called the starving times, and as well as the tobacco trade that ends up being kind of the life of Jamestown. So make sure that you tune in next week. If you have any questions, shoot me a message on Teams. Until then, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye!